Hi! Today I will be reviewing the Korean film A Resistance, directed by Cho Min-ho and starring Go Ah-sung, Ryu Kung-soo, Lee Oh-ki, and Sebyuk Kim. Before I begin, I'd like to provide a little disclaimer that I am not a native Korean speaker, so I'd like to apologize for any Korean names or words I mispronounce in this video. Anyways, back to the video. This movie was first released on February 27, 2019, and has received mixed reviews since. One thing that all viewers agree with, however, is that the original story that the film was based on was very impactful. This film depicts the life of a young freedom fighter, Yoo Kwon-sun, played by actress Go Ah-sung. Yoo became one of the most well-known participants in the independence movement, and eventually became a symbol of Korea's fight for independence. Let's quickly take a break to recap Korean history at this point to provide better context. So Korea was known as the Joseon dynasty, and up until around the 1850s, it had been experiencing 2 whole centuries of peace. However, starting in the 1850s, this dynasty started experiencing some issues due to foreign countries and their development and changes, and their growing interest in Korea. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea and thus began Japan's colonial rule of Korea. During this period, Japan attempted to erase Korean culture and lifestyle, and essentially wanted to turn Korea into an extended part of Japan. The Japanese authorities committed many crimes and treated Koreans very poorly. During this period, around 1915, is when Yoo started her activism. Her first act of protest was when she participated in the March 1st movement in Seoul. This movement was one of the first signs of Korean resistance against Japanese rule. She continued to protest with her classmates and even got detained by Japanese authorities once. However, she was released after her school negotiated her release. She then came back to her village with a stolen copy of the Korean Declaration of Independence and went around to all the houses and urging others to join this movement. This led to the protest on April 1st, which is what she goes to jail for in the film. The film is predominantly shot in black and white and lacks a soundtrack or any background music, in an attempt to provide a more raw footage and more raw feel to the overall film. The film opens with Yoo being moved to Sodemun prison, and we can see that she is already in a very bad condition. She can barely walk, she is very weak, and clearly hasn't bathed or been fed well in a really long time. We are also introduced to a prison guard named Nishida, who is Korean but speaks Japanese and is working for the Japanese police officials. He claims he took this job to serve Japan, but soon admits that he was in a desperate need of a well-paying job to support his family. While there are many other characters introduced in this film, Yoo remains the main focus and gets most of the screen time. We almost immediately find out that she is not a submissive girl and is quite rebellious in the way she talks to the Japanese officials and guards. This attitude of hers draws the audience's full attention towards this 16-year-old girl. She is locked up in prison cell number 8 with around 30 other Korean women. This is where the film truly begins. Throughout the film, we get to see Yoo's time in this prison and all the people she meets, the bonds she creates with some of them, and their stories. One particular scene that depicts this immediate sense of unity among the inmates of prison cell 8 is when they all walk in circles singing Arirang. This moment gives them all a sense of hope and joy, even though their conditions are absolutely horrifying. In addition, through little colorful snippets, we get to see a glimpse of her life before she ended up in this situation. We see her with her family and her brother, we see her making Korean flags for the protest, and we see her as just a 16-year-old girl. And we also get to see the incident that resulted in her arrest. Here she is taking part in the protest when Japanese officials show up and attack the protesters. She sees her parents brutally murdered right in front of her eyes, while her brother holds her screaming body back. This gives us insight into the trauma she has experienced and also some justification for this extreme hatred she hates for the Japanese. We also get to see how this relentless girl attempts to instill strength and patriotism within her cellmates and even the whole prison. One such instance is when she decided to hold her own prison protest on the anniversary of the March 1st movement. This scene shows her starting to yell "Manse" in her cell, and other inmates hearing this and joining in. Even her brother in the men's prison hears this and joins in. Ultimately, the regular citizens of the nearby town hear it from the prison and start protesting as well. This scene was very powerful because it showed how no matter how much the Japanese try to silence the Koreans, they will still fight for their cause, even from prison. It was very representative of Yu's whole ideology, that prison is not the end of fighting, and the real end is when Korea finally gets its independence. After this scene, we see how she pays for her actions. The Japanese official tortures her and gives her all sorts of horrible punishments in an attempt to silence her, and he even forces Nishida to accompany him in order to test his loyalty. In this film, Nishida predominantly serves as an opposing character to Yu. It shows what would have happened if Yu had been submissive like Nishida. She would have ended up like Nishida, working for people she hates, working for people who torture her own kind, which is exactly what Nishida experiences every day. I would go more in depth into the torturing, but I'm not going to lie, I closed my eyes for most of them. So you will have to watch this film and see for yourself. The prison officials realized that Yu is the leader for this movement in the prison, so he was very determined to make an example out of her. Regardless of all the horrible things he did to her, she remained loyal to her country and her cause and refused to be submissive. She was so passionate and truly believed in her cause, and that was very inspirational for the viewers. While the other people in her cell were freed eventually, she ended up having to serve a longer sentence and was put in an isolated cell. She died on September 28, 1920, from injuries she sustained from torture and beatings inflicted by the Japanese prison officers. She was just 17 years old. Until her dying breath, she was a fighter and truly loved her nation. On her prison walls, she wrote, "Japan will fail." This was a very touching and inspirational story, especially considering that it was based on a true story. While Yu's actions didn't result in the immediate freedom of Korea, it provided a great sense of hope and strength to the citizens of Korea and urged them to fight. The March 1st movement also resulted in the Japanese colonial government soon implementing more lenient political controls. I enjoyed this movie as it gave me an interesting way to learn about this amazing historical figure, Yu Guansun, whom I hadn't previously heard of and whom I probably wouldn't have known about unless I watched this film. I really enjoyed this. I hope you watch this film and enjoy it as well. Thank you.